Chuck Todd is NBC's political director and, of course, the moderator of Meet the Press. Chuck, good morning. Always good to see you.
Morning.
As Kelly said, the president repeated no collusion. He also said these reports, these filings that we saw both from the special counsel's office and from prosecutors here in the Southern District of New York, quote, totally clears the president. That's not true at all, of course. But what should the president be most worried about here? Because, as Kelly did report, the prosecutors in the Southern District of New York, not Mueller yet, but the prosecutors said they see a path where the president directed payments to Stormy Daniels and to another woman during the campaign that could have influenced the election.
Yes, a felony. Okay,
yeah, right.
Pure and simple. And yes, there may be some questions. There's a reason they're not quite ready to call him an unindicted co-conspirator, but that doesn't mean that they might not, if they have more evidence to know that the president knew he'd be breaking a campaign finance law in advance. But, Willie, I think the more troubling accusation is in Bob Mueller's memo on Michael Cohen's sentencing memo, where in there Michael Cohen is alleging that in his false testimony to Congress, that the prepared testimony, which he knew was false, which he has pled guilty to, had been circulated among those in Trump's orbit at the White House. Well, who? And more importantly, that means in advance, there are those at the White House, those around the president, maybe he himself knew this, they knew in advance that Michael Cohen was going to mislead Congress. That just shows you that the obstruction case that Bob Mueller can build against the president is a lot stronger and I think a lot deeper than any of his defenders have ever thought it would be.
And it also shows outreach to Russians and contact with Russians dating back to 2015. Chuck, as you know, Nancy Pelosi, other Democrats have been careful about using the word impeachment. They don't necessarily want to go there. But we did hear yesterday from Congressman Jerry Nadler, the New York Democrat who will take over the Judiciary Committee come January. He started talking about, quote, a massive fraud against the American people. What he's talking about is that prosecutor's document where President Trump directed Michael Cohen to pay off these women because that may, in the view of prosecutors, influence the outcome of the election. Right. Are we going to hear more of this in January now from leading Democrats that maybe there are impeachable offenses here?
I think it's inevitable. And in fact, I think there's going to be a point where House Democrats are going to feel as if they don't open an impeachment inquiry over what they've seen so far, then what would be the trigger? A future Congress in 25 years may be upset that this next Congress didn't do it. There is so much alleged law breaking that has taken place that if Congress at all wants to be a watchdog for the executive branch, I think it's inevitable. So, look, I think it's inevitable that an impeachment inquiry is going to get open. And as Jerry Nadler says, that doesn't mean they will end up impeaching him.
Right.
But I think the investigation is going to open sooner rather than later.
They at least have to go there. Chuck, I want to ask you about John Kelly, the chief of staff, longtime chief of staff, four-star Marine general. The president announcing yesterday he's leaving at the end of the year. You can add to that list a new nominee for attorney general, for the UN ambassador, a new chairman for the Joint Chiefs of Staff, all just in the last couple of days. A lot of turnover here in the White House. But what is the impact of John Kelly leaving this White House?
Well, I don't really know it will have that much impact other than maybe you'll have a few less leaks of the backbiting that goes on in there. I mean, it seems as if from the day he started the job, the relationship between the president and his chief of staff was fraught. So I don't know that it actually has much of an impact other than on paper. I think the president should have a chief of staff that has a lot more political experience and campaign experience than John Kelly when you're preparing for a reelect. So on paper, it makes a lot of sense to me. But I don't know if it's going to somehow make the place look like it runs any smoother than it does now, because ultimately the president wants to be his own chief of staff.
That's right. A lot to talk about again this morning. Chuck, thanks so much. We'll look for more on Meet the Press when Chuck talks about the Russia investigation, among other topics, with a pair of senators, Republican Rand Paul and Independent Angus King of Maine.